friends. It's a kind of an overcast, chilly day here in Berkeley Springs, but I thought we could talk a little bit about an event that I just returned from. On the weekend, I was in Orlando, Florida, where it was 84 degrees. And I was attending the World Economic Conference, which is a marvelous event that's put on by Martin Armstrong, the economist. It's been characterized by many of a number of people as an alternative to the World Economic Forum, which is held in Davos, Switzerland every year. And it draws a significant crowd of very successful people, all of whom are interested in the forecasts of Martin Armstrong. There were, I don't know, it's hard to tell because a goodly number of folks were joining the event by live stream, but there's maybe 30,000 people across the planet that were all engaged in this thing over the weekend. So it was a significant event. They all come and get together in order to hear Martin Armstrong, the forecaster, world's probably greatest forecaster. The thing that makes this interesting is that Marty just sits there and talks and nothing, and largely nothing else. Sometimes there's some questions and answers, but starting on Friday afternoon and going through Sunday after lunch, it's just him standing up there and talking. And so you might say, why in the world would you sit there and listen to somebody that just talks and generates and promulgates his opinions for that long? And the thing that's different about this, if you're not familiar with it, is that Martin Armstrong has developed this computer program called Socrates. And Socrates is unique on the planet in that it is based upon the underlying cyclical characteristics of different aspects of this life. The principle is that everything operates on cycles and vibrates, if you will. This is more like kind of long-term pendulum kind of swinging kind of things. And Marty early on figured that out and has developed what is an artificial intelligence program that learns on its own and is based upon 72 different kind of modules that describe the cyclical kind of characteristics of everything from the climate to geopolitics to economics to the financial system to the New York Stock Exchange, commodities, and it's primarily about money because that's what most of the people are interested in there. But it is also much larger than that in terms of being able to see big trends and where they're going. The important thing and the thing that draws so many people is that the computer has never been wrong in the 40 years that it has been operating. And he made the case this year, as he always does, is that he has tried in the past to prove the computer wrong because the predictions or the prognostications that it generates seem so strange sometimes. But he's always been wrong and the computer's always been right. And so what he does is just stands up there and tells you what the computer says. He certainly introduces some of his own opinions in this particular case and through the length of time over the weekend. But the basis of the whole thing is kind of unadulterated output that the computer suggests going forward. And so I thought I'd talk to you a little bit about what the rather extraordinary kind of things that he had to say and what the computer is suggesting in the coming years. And all I'd say again is that it's never been wrong, and it chooses events with extraordinary, amazing kind of accuracy. I've often told the story that I was down there at the meeting in about October of 2019. And he stood up there and says, I don't know what it is, but the computer says that on the 19th and 20th of January of next year, 2020, that some very large event's going to happen that's going to change the world. He says it, I can't tell what it is. He said, maybe Hillary will decide that she wants to come into the campaign and run for president or something like that. He says, I don't know what it is. So you wait until the 19th and 20th of January and you look around and you say, what in the world? Nothing ever happened. And it takes you to the 21st, literally in my case, and suddenly it just blows up in your brain. It's COVID. And that COVID kind of inserted itself into the global narrative, and the computer had it to the day from months beforehand, and that's the significance of all of this. And so Marty has always, and for a long time at least, has talked about the kind of long-term forecasts that the computer is suggesting, and but it was qualitatively different this time. There was an emotional kind of commitment and a definitive kind of characterization of these things that we've not seen in the past. And so it's worthwhile, as you will see here in a minute, to think about what the implications of some of this might be. He is generally is of the opinion that number one, that the leadership in the Western countries is the worst he's ever seen it in his life, and it might be in the recent history, modern history. That there are extraordinarily dysfunctional and irrational things that are being done, all in the interest of the narrative is of climate change, and that they're making foolish, crazy decisions that are guaranteed to bring down the global economy. For example, the whole orientation toward getting away from fossil fuels and moving toward wind and solar is meritorious at first blush, but if you say that you're going to shut down all of the drilling and all of the natural gas and the other kinds of things because you're trying to drive people toward solar systems and wind generation and so on, you've got a problem, because there's only something like 5 or 7% of the power that's generated on the planet comes from those sources, and it's impossible to meet the demand, the huge demand across the planet for electricity with those sources. And so what they're doing is killing, both in terms of in this country where they're saying that they're not going to let anybody drill anymore for oil, or they're going to shut down coal-fired power plants and such. There is no alternative, and what is happening is that there's a huge kind of problems that are showing up in any of a number of places, but particularly in Europe, where it's going to be very cold and people will die this winter because they won't have heat. And it's all because of these policies that make no sense. They run counter to the fundamental interests of the people that the politicians are supposedly represent. And so Marty asks the question and says it can't, it makes so much makes no sense, that I've come to the opinion that it's planned, that there is some other agenda behind the whole thing, and that the whole climate change notion is merely a cover story for something deeper that they have coming, that they have going. And so the height, the top end, the high level kind of story is that that for years, decades now, what countries have been doing and central banks have been doing, countries in particular have been borrowing money, issuing currencies and borrowing money with no way at all to pay it back, and no intention of paying it back. And so what you have is huge amounts, many, trillions of dollars, 20, scores of trillions of dollars worth of obligations that are coming due in terms of bonds, and the interest rates are becoming so great that there is no way that the system can sustain itself, the economic system. This is a variation of the message that David Martin gave at our transition talks in this summertime here. It's he said that by 2027 that there's an inevitable kind of collapse of the whole system, because it will be, he says that Social Security and all of the pension funds and everything else are going to collapse, because there will not be, there is no way at all that they can be serviced. And what they talked about, what among other things they talked about in this meeting in Florida, was that in the last 6 months, the Swiss have lost $120 billion in pension funds just in the last 6 months. And this is all because the whole system is not sustainable in the way that it's designed. The problem with pension funds is that they are often the government mandates this with pension funds, that a majority of their assets needs to be in government bonds, which presumably are more stable and safe than if it were in the capital markets, in stocks and so on. And right now, because of these policies that they've put in place, the whole bond system, and as they've increased in interest rates and so on, the bonds are going into the toilet, and in the process, the ability of the capabilities of pension funds, the asset base, are collapsing rapidly, falling off. And it's happening in the United States, and it's happening in Europe in spades. At the same time, there's been a 40% increase in the money supply on the planet in the last 2 years. And you might ask, where does that come from? Well, the central banks are just making it up. And again, what that does is depreciate the value of the money that's in play in the system. And there are these structural kind of forces that are in play here that have come out of control. They've gotten out of control, and it's at the place where it's impossible that the central banks and the governments can, in any conceivable way, can pay the obligations that are due. And so this strategy to kind of solve this looming problem. And this is the position of Klaus Schwab, who is, and George Soros. Klaus Schwab's the head of the World Economic Forum. Their position is that they collapse the whole economy, and in this process, what they can do is they can get rid of all of the debt, and they can start over again. And so the way Marty sees it is that the whole argument around climate change and everything is a facade. It's a scam to collapse the whole situation so that they can get out, so the governments can get out, and the central banks can get out from under the obligation that they've put themselves in. Marty says in the past, he suggested alternative ways in which they could do this, but they have decided that what they're going to do is collapse the whole system. And as you look around yourself and you look at supply chain problems and any number of other kind of things, you can see that they're working very hard, and they're very explicit about this on the World Economic Forum's website about what they're doing and why they're trying to do it. What Marty suggests is that they're using the whole climate change narrative as a front story in order to do this. And the other variation of the narrative is that they're talking about that they're going to have a jubilee, a debt jubilee, and they'll wipe out all of the debts obligations that everybody has. So your mortgage and your car payments and your credit cards and everything got cleaned out all on one jubilee day. And they're trying to sell that to the populace as a wonderful thing that they're doing for them, when in fact what they're really trying to do here is to get rid of the extraordinary obligations that the banks and the countries have, and trying to change the story and spin the whole thing and try to tell people that they'll get them out of their own kind of obligations. And so it is the notion that you would collapse the global economy are not just kind of theoretical words in this particular case. They are actually being implemented, and you can see it happening all over the place. By the way, they are, from his point of view, they are the war in Ukraine is they've pushed Russia into this thing and forced the whole thing. And that, again, is a mechanism that they can use to not only collapse the economy, but also get rid of it. It's in essence a way to kind of launder money, because wars generate all these extraordinary kind of expenses. That what it does is drive the system off of the peaceful kind of operation that is the underlying problem right now. They've got to kind of drive this thing, get it off the tracks of where it's going. And so he says what Martin says here is that there of course are cycles under this, predictable cycles. And so he says that his computer for 40 years from the very beginning has been saying that there was going to be this huge kind of crisis that was going to happen between 2023 and 2033, I guess. And that there was going to be a complete upheaval of this. And early on, it was so far out on the horizon that it was theoretical. But as it gets closer, what you start to see from multiple points of view. So this is not Marty's computer program produces something like 1,500 reports a day on the situation of all of these every kind of major financial, certainly and political situation in the world. It had the program has no parallel, certainly in the open area. I don't know what's going on in black programs in the government somewhere, but certainly there's nothing else that approaches this. And so from the beginning, what the system has been saying is that there is going to be a global civil war between 2025 and 2027. Which I take to mean that there is a general uprising of people across, citizens across the planet against their governments. And if you want to get that idea in your head, that is to say, if it becomes part of the mechanism by which you try to make sense out of how things happen, what you can see is all over the planet. There are people in the streets, whether it's for COVID or whether it's for financial things or whatever the event is or whatever the issue is. There's a level of disruption and unhappiness with government that I certainly never has been the case any time in my life, and certainly not in recent history. And so Marty has talked about that in the past, but what he's talked about this time was kind of qualitatively different. As I said, there was a specificity about it, and he brought in, in the case of the global civil war and the subsequent kind of events that will happen, he talked about how this was not a single kind of analysis that's coming out of the computer, but it's showing up from many, many, many different things. So whether you look at corn futures or the euro or the dollar or any number of kind of pieces of the large kind of economic and financial system, they all point to the same thing. And what they say is that 2023, next year, is going to be what he has characterized in the past as a year from hell. And that he says that World War III will start in January of next year, by the first quarter. And I think he's hedging it a bit. He talked a good bit about April. But in any case, there's a period of time in the first third of the year when what it appears to be, and he will argue that it's inevitable because what they've done is kind of driven themselves into a corner and they can't get out of it. Perhaps somebody will sue for peace and we will get some negotiated way out of this war in Ukraine. But what it really looks like is that the United States government is doing everything they can to start this war. And that, again, one of the reasons they want to start a war with Russia and is to get the present economic, try to do something that will take away interest and attention from the failure of the economy and what's going on, and try to generate a whole kind of diversion almost. So he says that it is inevitable out of this global civil war that ends sometime around 2027, that there is the inevitable breakup and collapse of the United States of America. And he's saying 2028 at the very latest, that that the United States does not exist as a country anymore. And soon after that, the dollar declines as the central currency on the planet, and the whole locus of things moves towards China. He says that by 2032, this time he was saying there's about 3 different countries in North America, independent countries in North America. Before, he's talked about the possibility that there could be as many as 5 different countries in North America. And in this particular case, he's now doing kind of some analysis and interpretation. And so it's uncertain what the specifics might look like. I would tend to believe there would be more like 5 than 3, because just from a geographic point of view, it's hard to make the case. He was saying the West Coast, California, Oregon, and Washington would kind of break away, and the northeastern part of the United States would break away, and then there'd be the whole middle part. Well, it's not probably that simple. And you also have a very interesting, and I don't know exactly what this means, but there's the internet plays a role in here in terms of being able people to find common areas of common interest and security and whatever they're looking for in this environment. But anyway, it's probably, my guess is there's probably about 5 different countries, and it's probably works its way up through and includes what was previously Canada and Mexico in some kind of way. In any case, it's huge. It's just mind-bogglingly huge. The notion that in 5 years that you go from having these global civil wars to suddenly have this reorganization of all of the countries on this planet is one wonders how that all happens. I mean, if you think about it just a little bit, to start to say, well, how does the FAA work? How do you get airplanes from one place to another if you got these different countries? And how do you make the deal and the agreements that allow that to happen? What about, other kind of functions of government that have kept us all together and that we just take for granted? And if you can't pay the people because the financial system collapses, if you can't pay the people in the government to do and provide the services that we all depend upon, then how does that reorganize itself? There's an interesting byproduct of this whole process, and that is that as the inability of government to pay, the sequence kind of runs like this, is that as soon as it becomes apparent to the citizens that this system is coming apart and that the government may not exist in the near future, then they stop paying taxes. And when they stop paying taxes, then what that means is that the government, in any kind of way that we can make any kind of sense, the government can't pay the employees, their employees. And when they can't pay their employees, then the services that the government supplies rapidly degenerate. But more than that, there are people look around, perhaps like they did when the Soviet Union collapsed. They look around for whatever assets the government had and try to figure out a way to convert them into currency so that they can live in one way or another. And in this particular case, there are multiple sources that suggest that that as folks who are in the intelligence and uh, and defense areas are not able to sustain themselves and support themselves, then there becomes a kind of a movement of secrets revealed. That is to say, people who have the access to what otherwise in the past have been very deep secrets about all kinds of things, including technologies and so on, began to sell them. Perhaps to the press or other places, and try to convert them into some kind of revenue so that they can stay alive and keep their families alive and so on. So, and in any case, the whole system begins to unravel very rapidly, and the kind of scrambling around, the jockeying around that will go on to try to figure out who organizes and runs the new worlds and how that all works is beyond mind-boggling in terms of its complexity and the dynamics. I mean, if you did this over, say, 20 years or 30 years or something, you could see how people would have a chance to read. But if you have this all squished into 5 years, and a couple of those years are you've got this global civil war thing going, then it raises all kinds of problems that you might have been able to deal with. Not least of which is that the supply chains that support the present system all are beginning to erode. There's a serious problem with diesel fuel. I just drove up from Orlando, and I could buy gas for $3 and I don't know 30 cents a gallon, more or less. And diesel fuel is above $5 a gallon, and 5.20, 30. And I have never seen that kind of situation before, whether there was that much disparity between gasoline and diesel fuel, but there's an acute kind of shortage, and it is getting worse. And the whole economy runs on diesel fuel, all the trucks and generators and on and on and on. The only way you could get around is diesel is the most sensitive and important of the liquid fuels. And so if this doesn't work, then if you can't run your trucks and because you don't have fuel, then what happens is the food doesn't get to grocery stores, and parts don't get to places where you can repair things like cars, and there become shortages, and it just cascades across the whole system. And so you're seeing the early parts of that, and those are the kind of indications that, by the way, that are showing up in Armstrong's computer programs, and that are all pointing toward this kind of extraordinary event. The principles that the IMF and the Bank of International Settlements and the central banks and everything, the Keynesian economics that they're using as the basis for the decisions that they're making are, in Marty's opinion, fundamentally flawed, and they've never really worked well in the past. As often as not, when you make the interest rate changes or whatever it turns out to be, it generates secondary problems and things that nobody ever anticipated. And so it's a big issue that they're working from a flawed philosophy, essentially. what he says is that civilization exists when all of when the when the group provides the needs for all of the people. That's what keeps and holds a civilization or countries, and for that matter, together, is that there is a some level of provision for the essential needs of everybody within the group. And when that and when you're not able to do that, then you get this fraying of the civilization, and that's what you see going on in terms of these riots on the streets and the things that are going to show up going forward. The whole issue of shortages of food is a catalytic, uniquely kind of triggering and catalytic event, because it is in history, when you have famines, the natural outgrowth or byproduct of a famine is a revolution that brings down the government, because the government hasn't been able to supply the food, right? And so that may well be a central kind of component and issue that influences this broad base kind of degeneration. He says World War III is inevitable. He says that the first quarter of next year is 31.4 years from the fall of the USSR. Now that's important because in Marty's model, there are these basic cyclical relationships. And so it is predictive because in this particular case, you see the fall of the Soviet Union, and there is a 31.4 year kind of cycle before the next war starts or the next major upheaval. And he says it's April, is what he's saying these days. He says that the Ukraine war is just the beginning, and that what the United States is essentially doing is locking itself into a position that is going to force them to get involved in, I mean, the headlines today are already talking about moving American troops into Ukraine. And so rather than trying to solve this thing, Putin has multiple times said he's ready to sit down and talk about it, but they, for any of a number of reasons, the U.S. has told Zelensky that he can't do that. And so this is a really a big and serious thing. He says it's all when it starts to fragment like this, then civilization dies, and that's what we're seeing now. He was interestingly kind of fatalistic about this toward the end of his presentations. He said everything operates on a cycle. No country or empire lasts forever. And he goes down from the Romans and the whatever, and then all of them. He says they start, they grow to the top, and they end. That's the way it works. And he says that's what's happening here. It's tough to be in the middle of it, but it's inevitable. Nothing stays the same. There's an internal erosion, coupled with external forces and other things that all conspire to provide the space for the emergence of something new. This something new in this case, I would hope and argue, is a new world. He says everything moves all of the time. And it has these cyclical relationships, and everything will fail. And so it appears. that from his point of view, and certainly if you look more broadly across what's happening and try to make some sense out of it, you can certainly see that his framework and his model could very well make sense, and he could be at the beginning of this. Now, he could be early in being able to anticipate and anticipating all of this. Now, that is, in my kind of parlance, a conventional assessment of what is happening and likely to happen. That is to say, you look at the way the world works as we understand it, you still distill the different component parts of the system down into their basic metabolism, and the cycles are this cyclical, what's the oscillation, what's the rate of oscillation of each of the component parts. And then you aggregate those together into a sophisticated model that then begins to be predictive because you've figured out how the pieces of the individual pieces of the system work. Now, I have a question. I would suggest that we're into a period of time that is unconventional in far more sophisticated and more significant ways than just the conventional kind of assessment. For instance, and I don't have the answer to this, but if you have a massive solar flare that comes off of the sun that hits the earth, that when the sun is pointed our way and it comes off and it hits the earth, how is it that Martin Armstrong's computer model would anticipate that? Because that kind of a thing is not part of the internal kind of workings of things on our planet. It's exogenous, it's from the outside, right? And so how would his model be able to anticipate that? So you've got those kinds of external inputs that are not presumably kind of linked into the into the mechanism of the way our planet works, or not obviously so. I mean, people have not interpreted them to be that way. Another thing is, extraterrestrial life. We talk about that every once in a while. And if, in fact, that becomes, there's a disclosure and we begin an interaction with extraterrestrial life, how would Marty's model have anticipated that? Because it's never happened before, so that you don't have a basis for building the characteristic kind of vibrations or oscillations of that whole thing. And there could be any of a number of other things like that could, in fact, drive this off in another kind of direction. If you really want to get kind of out of the blocks, you can say, does the simulation that we live in continue the way it goes for the foreseeable future, throughout this period of time, or does it change in some kind of a way? I only mention that because a number of people, including Greg Braden and some other friends, all suggest that indications are all, Elon Musk believes this, for instance, that we live in a simulation. Well, maybe you can describe some of the workings of that simulation, but maybe there's an external, somebody punches a button from the outside. I don't know. The point I'm trying to make is that although Marty's machine has always been accurate in the past in extraordinary ways, and that you can see the indications, the converging indications that suggest that it's likely to be accurate in the future. But nevertheless, it would I think, be foolish to presume that everything that could happen has been thought about and made and built into these kinds of models. They certainly haven't in any other kind of models. And so maybe it's not unlikely that there are some aspects of Marty's model that are blind to some of these other things. So what does this say about what we ought to do, and how do you get ready for this? I put in, I did a question. I answered a question in our question answering session that I do for PostScript, where a friend of mine asked if Martin Armstrong says that 2023 is the year from hell. How do you prepare for that? Well, certainly you try to think about the lower part of the Maslow hierarchy. How do you do food and water and electricity, and shelter and community and all of those kind of things that allow a degree of independence that you otherwise didn't need, and that you presumed from, that the system would give you because the system worked well. But there's another higher kind of level associated with this, which is about kind of getting a mindset that allows you the latitude to be creative and innovative and do things that you haven't other done. And that says nothing about the even higher notion about how you become a different human being in order to be able to rise to the occasion and prevail throughout this whole process. And so in any case, there are, I believe, some clear paths and processes and ways in which we can get through all of this. But with any kind of conventional perspective, it seems very hard to believe that you can get out of the back end of this thing without some very dramatic kind of disruption that calls into question almost all of the presumptions and assumptions that you've had about how things work and how you take care of yourself and how people act even, and other such things. And so it's a giant time of reorganization and reconfiguration. And we're going to be here at the Arlington Institute and try to think about that as it goes along and be able to generate as much information for you all as we can about how to deal with this and different kind of options that are available. So thanks. And if you like this, I hope you indicate like and share it with folks and send it around, and so that as many people as possible can start to think about all of these kind of possibilities in a different way. So thank you.